Uncle Blue to the Rescue by Shimon. Prologue. The neighborhood clock struck 3, and the air shifted. It was a subtle vibration in the pavement, a low-frequency hum that signaled the arrival of a legend. Amber adjusted her apron, her breath hitching in her chest as the familiar red convertible pulled into the driveway. She knew the rules. She knew the fleeting nature of this connection. Yet every time the car door creaked open, her heart forgot its logic. The kids were already at the window, faces pressed against the glass, screaming his name as if he were a visiting king. Uncle Blue was back, and with him, the absolute certainty that the next 48 hours would be anything but ordinary. Scene 1. Turbo and Sparkplug meet Blue. The engine of the vintage charcoal sedan ticked as it cooled in the driveway, a rhythmic metallic pinging that sounded to Uncle Blue like the heartbeat of a man who had nowhere else to be. He adjusted his collar in the rearview mirror, checking his reflection for any stray evidence of his last stop none found. His life was a ledger of arrivals and departures, a collection of encrypted memories kept in a small, leather-bound book tucked into his jacket pocket. He took a breath, letting the anticipation of the next few days sharpen his senses, before grabbing the towering stack of gourmet pizza boxes from the passenger seat. Inside the house, Leo, whom Blue knew only as Turbo, was vibrating with the kinetic energy of a 10-year-old who had spent the last hour staring out the living room window. His sister, Mia, known as Sparkplug, was currently engaged in an intense battle with a tangled ball of neon green yarn. Rachel stood in the kitchen, smoothing the front of her silk blouse, her gaze fixed on the front door with a hunger that had nothing to do with the imminent arrival of dinner. She was a woman of precise habits and deep, quiet storms, and when she caught the sound of the car door slamming, her pulse skipped. She turned toward the hallway, her posture softening. "He's here!" Turbo shouted, his voice cracking with excitement as he scrambled toward the entryway. Sparkplug abandoned the yarn, her face erupting into a wide, gap-toothed grin as she sprinted to join her brother. Uncle Blue swung the door open, the scent of pepperoni, basil, and wood-fired crust filling the foyer like a warm embrace. "Did somebody order a delivery for 2 of the fastest kids in the neighborhood?" he asked, his voice smooth and playful. "Uncle Blue?" The children cheered in unison, colliding with his legs. Blue chuckled, crouching down to their level while balancing the pizza boxes with practiced ease. He dropped the boxes onto the floor and immediately initiated a high-five chain that ended in a mock wrestling match. Rachel watched from the doorway, her hands tucked into the pockets of her trousers. The sight of him, this transient, brilliant force of nature, always managed to make the house feel too small. She stepped forward, her eyes locked with his. "You're late," she whispered, the rebuke lacking any real weight, softened by the way her gaze traced the line of his jaw. "The traffic was a masterclass in inefficiency," Blue replied, rising to his full height. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a register only she could hear. "But I made up for it." He didn't waste time. Before the kids could start unboxing the meal, he produced a heavy-duty braided jump rope from his pocket. "All right, clear the floor. We aren't eating until we get the rhythm down. Turbo, Sparkplug, show me what you learned in school today." Turbo took the handles, his expression turning serious. "We learned about the history of the steam engine, how pressure creates motion. It was okay, I guess." Blue frowned, shaking his head. "Okay, you can't have a good day if you don't learn something that sets your brain on fire." "Why was it just okay?" "Because it was just a video," Sparkplug added, shrugging. "The teacher just played it and we had to write a paragraph." Blue stepped behind them, taking the handles. "Listen, a steam engine isn't just pressure. It's the art of capturing chaos and turning it into purpose. You take that energy, you refine it, and you move the world forward." He started the rope, the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack hitting the hardwood floor. He guided them through a double jump sequence, his movements fluid and precise. He kept the cadence tight, his instructions simple and encouraging, turning a mundane exercise into a high-octane lesson in biomechanics and focus. They jumped until they were breathless, their laughter echoing against the high ceilings of the foyer. After 20 minutes, the kids were sufficiently winded and distracted by the pizza. Blue signaled to Rachel with a subtle tilt of his head toward the kitchen. "Rachel," he said, loud enough for the kids to hear. I noticed the spice rack is a little chaotic. Looks like everything is shoved behind the paprika. Rachel understood the cue immediately, her heart thumping against her ribs. She turned to the children. Turbo, Sparkplug, you two focus on the pizza. I need your Uncle Blue to help me reorganize the pantry spice rack by color. It's a very complicated system, and I can't handle it alone. The kids, occupied by their first slice of margarita, barely looked up. They followed the directions without hesitation. In the narrow, dim space of the pantry, the air was heavy with the smell of dried herbs and the sudden, electric tension of two people who had been waiting for the door to close. Blue leaned against the shelving, his back to the door. Rachel moved into his space, her skepticism and her craving for stability momentarily eclipsed by the sheer gravity of his presence. She looked up at him, her voice barely a breath. You always come back just when I've convinced myself you're a figment of my imagination. I told you, Blue replied softly, his hands coming up to cup her face. I don't leave things unfinished. He kissed her then, a deep, lingering press of lips that tasted of salt and secrets. It wasn't a tentative exploration, it was a reclamation of the time lost since his last visit. For a few seconds, the pantry wasn't a storage room, it was the only place in the world that mattered. The silence in the hallway, punctuated only by the clatter of plastic plates, served to heighten the isolation of their embrace. When they pulled apart, Rachel's eyes were bright, her breath ragged. She reached up to adjust his collar, her fingers lingering on the fabric. I keep telling my friends I'm just waiting for someone who can actually handle this life, she murmured, a trace of vulnerability creeping into her tone. They say you're a nomad, that you don't build roots. Blue leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. This is exactly what you said you wanted, Rachel. No expectations, no strings, just the reality of the present. You were the one who told me you were done with the heavy, binding stuff until someone proved they could match your pace. I'm just holding up my end of the bargain. Rachel nodded, though her heart pulled against the logic. She knew the reality of his rotation, the small, quiet lives he touched before vanishing again. Yet she couldn't bring herself to push him away. She leaned into his chest, closing her eyes, letting the transient nature of his visit ground her in a way that stability never had. That was great, Blue whispered into the space between them, his voice thick with a strange, lingering reverence. And always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else. He pulled away, his expression shifting back to his trademark charming smile as he grabbed a jar of cumin to signal the end of their retreat. Now, let's get these spices sorted before the kids realize we haven't actually organized anything. Scene 2, Physics in the living room. The silence in the room was not empty. It was a pressurized chamber waiting for the spark. Uncle Blue stood in the center of Rachel's living room, surrounded by a jagged, sprawling fortress of repurposed cardboard boxes, tape, and plastic funnels. His mind was a high-frequency transmitter, constantly scanning for the next point of connection. He didn't just exist in a space, he altered its equilibrium. Turbo, Sparkplug, Uncle Blue said, his voice dropping into that familiar, conspiratorial register that made the world feel like an infinite playground. Physics isn't about equations on a chalkboard. It's about energy deciding where it wants to go next. Leo, known to the world as Turbo, gripped a polished glass marble with the intensity of a diamond cutter. Beside him, Mia Sparkplug was already lining up the secondary track, her eyes wide with the raw thrill of the experiment. The sheer domesticity of the scene was a thin veil over the profound mechanical precision Blue was building. "What did you learn in school today?" Blue asked, not looking up from the marble track he was reinforcing with masking tape. Turbo looked at his sister, then back at Blue, his shoulders dropping. "Nothing much, just some history about old maps." Blue stopped his hands. The room felt colder for a heartbeat. He turned slowly, his gaze leveling with the boy. "That's a dangerous way to look at a Tuesday. If you think you learned nothing, you've wasted an entire rotation of the Earth. You can't tell me a schoolful full of teachers and books didn't give you one tiny thread to pull on." Turbo shifted, looking at the cardboard contraption. "Well, we talked about how maps used to be blank in the corners. Here be monsters, they called them. Blue let out a sharp, genuine laugh. Exactly. That wasn't fear, Turbo. That was the edge of imagination. That was the point where they stopped knowing and started dreaming. That was great. And always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else. Rachel stood in the doorway of the kitchen, leaning against the frame with a grace that suggested she had been watching for quite some time. She was dressed in a soft, emerald-colored silk blouse that caught the afternoon light, her hair pinned up with a casual efficiency that felt like a challenge. She wasn't just observing the physics lesson. She was measuring the distance between herself and the man who currently filled her home with noise and light. While the children adjusted the slope of their ramp, Rachel stepped into the living room, her movements fluid and purposeful. The tension between her and Blue was a tangible weight, an unresolved argument from the previous night that hadn't been settled. "You're pushing them hard again," Rachel whispered, stepping close enough that the scent of cedar and clean rain clinging to Blue reached her. "I'm teaching them to look over the edge," Blue countered, his voice low, vibrating with a suppressed intensity. "You want them to be safe, Rachel. I want them to be capable." Rachel's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine fire crossing her expression. "There is a difference between capability and chaos. You come here, you shake the walls, and then you leave. It's not fair to them, and it's certainly not fair to me." "You said you liked the wind," Blue retorted, his eyes searching hers for the doubt he knew was there. "I like the breeze," she snapped back, though her hand brushed his arm, a lingering, involuntary touch that betrayed her frustration. "I didn't ask for a hurricane." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you can just keep this up? Moving from house to house? You aren't building a future, Blue. You're building a labyrinth." Blue caught her wrist, his grip firm but careful. The air between them hummed with the electricity of their friction. "I'm building a network. You're just looking at the blueprints from the wrong side of the wall." He pulled her behind the oversized sofa, shielding them from the sightline of the children. In the shadowed pocket of the room, the anger melted into something sharper, more urgent. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Rachel sighed, the sound ragged and relieved. She didn't hold back. She reached up, burying her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer as they shared a kiss that was both a surrender and a battle cry, an apology for words said in haste, and an admission of the magnetic pull that neither could deny. A moment later, they broke apart, breathless. Rachel adjusted her blouse, her eyes bright with a mixture of defiance and affection. She looked toward the children, who were currently distracted by a rogue marble bouncing off the baseboard. "Leo, Mia," Rachel called out, her voice regaining its composure. "I need you to go into the find the manual for the old lawnmower. Uncle Blue and I need to do some very serious, very boring calculations regarding its fuel efficiency." Turbo looked up, bewildered. "The mower doesn't even run, Mom." "Exactly," Rachel said, her eyes locked on Blue's with a faint, knowing smirk. "That's why the math is so complicated. Go, now." The kids sprinted off, their footsteps thumping against the hardwood until the silence of the house settled back in, heavy and pregnant with the echoes of their presence. Blue leaned back against the sofa, watching Rachel as she stood in the center of the room, looking at him as if he were a puzzle she had finally decided she didn't want to solve, but rather simply inhabit. "Fuel efficiency, really?" Blue chuckled, the sound deep and resonant. "It's a start," she replied, her voice soft. "Now tell me why you really came back this time." Scene 3. The final day with Rachel. The heavy, humid air of late afternoon clung to the porch. Smelling faintly of cut grass and the lingering sweetness of the lemon bars Rachel had baked to celebrate the last day of Uncle Blue's residency. Blue stood in the center of the yard, watching the way the sunlight hit the polished wood of the floorboards, feeling the familiar, restless itch of a man who knew his time in one place was finite. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, his movements precise, almost kinetic. Inside the kitchen, Rachel moved with a rhythmic grace, her eyes tracing his silhouette through the screen door. She wasn't just observing him, she was measuring the space he occupied, wondering how much of it would remain once he packed his bags. "Turbo, Sparkplug, get over here," Uncle Blue called out, his voice smooth and commanding. He held two wooden tops in his palms, their tapered points glistening in the sun. He sprinted across the lawn, their laughter echoing against the quiet neighborhood. "I'm ready, Uncle Blue." Leo, whom Blue called Turbo, chirped, his eyes wide with anticipation. Mia, his younger sister, whom Blue called Sparkplug, hopped on one foot, eager for the lesson. "Today, we conquer gravity," Blue said, crouching down to their level. He placed a top on the flat concrete patio. "I want you to spin these. When they're just sitting there, they fall. But when they spin, they defy the downward pull. It's called gyroscopic stability." He demonstrated, snapping his wrist with practiced ease. The top hummed, a blurred diamond of motion. "It's about angular momentum. The object keeps its orientation in space because of that spin. The faster it goes, the more stubborn it is about staying upright." Turbo reached out, trying to replicate the motion, but his top wobbled and tumbled. "Nothing, Uncle Blue. I learned nothing today because I can't get it to stay up." Blue shook his head, his expression shifting into that rare, piercing intensity. "A kid can't have a good day if they don't learn anything." "Think, Turbo. Why did it fall? Because you didn't give it enough energy, enough velocity. Life is the same. If you don't put in the sustained effort, you lose your balance. That's a fundamental physical fact." Sparkplug stepped in, watched closely, and gave her top a sharp, focused twist. It stood tall, wobbling slightly before catching its rhythm. "It's staying," she shouted. "That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else," Blue said, his voice dropping an octave as he stood up. He watched the kids scramble to maintain their tops, his mind already calculating the logistics of the next household in his rotation. Inside, Rachel leaned against the kitchen island, wiping her hands on a cloth. She watched the way Blue interacted with the children, not as a visitor, but as a temporary, vital fixture. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability, the kind she usually buried under a layer of composed domesticity. She walked out to the porch, the screen door clicking softly behind her. "They adore you, you know," Rachel said, her voice soft. She moved closer, the scent of vanilla and citrus trailing her. "You have this way of making them feel like they're the only ones in the room." Blue turned to her, his gaze shifting from the distant horizon to her face. He didn't offer a platitude. He studied the way she stood, the slight hesitation in her posture that betrayed her desire for something more permanent. "They're smart kids, Rachel. They just need to know how to keep their momentum. Is that all it is for you?" Rachel asked, stepping into his personal space, her hand brushing against his arm. "Momentum? I've been thinking, Blue. Maybe it doesn't have to be a rotation. Maybe this could be a destination." Blue felt the heat of her touch, the sudden tension in the air turning the oxygen thin. He wanted to reach out to let the vulnerability show, but he remained anchored in his own specific nomadic truth. He leaned in, his voice a low, raspy murmur. "Rachel, we both know the script. You told your friends at brunch last week that you were just biding your time, kicking it with me until you found someone with the bank account to match your ambitions. You're looking for a rich man to settle down, and we both know I'm just the guy who shows up to make the days interesting before the next act." Rachel flushed, a mix of indignation and raw desire crossing her features. "You have a cruel way of reminding me of my own words." "I have a way of keeping things honest," he countered. He pulled her closer, his hand coming up to cup her jaw. There was no hesitation now, only the sudden, electric collision of two people who understood the game, but were currently losing the battle to ignore it. He kissed her, not with the gentleness he showed the children, but with a desperate, scorched earth intensity that seemed to acknowledge the ticking clock. She pressed into him, her fingers clutching the back of his shirt as if she could physically hold him in place. For a heartbeat, the world felt like it had stopped its rotation, the physics of their situation momentarily inverted. Then he pulled back, breathless, his eyes dark and steady. "I have to move on," he whispered. "The router needs fixing, The budget is a mess, and there's a leak in the kitchen sink that requires a very specific, grown-up set of tools. You and I have things to discuss, but first, you need to get them to bed." Rachel looked at him, her eyes searching his for a crack in the armor, but found only the familiar, hyper-focused resolve. She nodded, the resignation settling in. "I'll get them inside. I'll make sure the excuses are airtight." "They always are," Blue said, watching as she turned back to the yard. He looked down at the spinning top still humming on the concrete, its steady, defiant drone a reminder of his own trajectory. He was already halfway to the next house in his mind, already planning the next lesson, the next city, the next set of lives to touch. He wasn't a man who left. He was a man who moved, and in the quiet of the cooling evening, he wondered if the instability was the only thing keeping him upright. Scene 4. Crash and Giggles welcome Blue. "If you drop that cone, you're looking at a structural failure of epic proportions, and I am not responsible for the sticky aftermath," Uncle Blue said, his voice dancing with a sharp, playful cadence as he stepped through the sliding glass door of the sun-drenched kitchen. Monica spun around, a wooden spoon still clutched in her hand, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of him. She wore a silk wrap dress that clung to her silhouette, her hair swept up in a loose, effortless knot that suggested she'd been hoping for his arrival. "You have a knack for perfect timing, Blue, though my floor is currently clean and I'd like to keep it that way," she said, her pulse visibly fluttering at the base of her throat. Behind him, 2 children sprinted into the room, their laughter echoing against the tile. "Uncle Blue, you're back!" Ethan shouted, charging forward, followed closely by Lily, who was bouncing on her tiptoes. "Hey there, Crash, and hello to my favorite Giggles," Uncle Blue said, hoisting a massive insulated cooler onto the kitchen island with a confident thud. He opened the lid, revealing a mountain of strawberry ice cream that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. "Is it really happening?" Lily asked, her eyes wide as she peered into the frozen treasure. "Ice cream day is back on the menu," Uncle Blue confirmed, winking at Monica. Monica watched the interaction, her gaze softening. She admired how effortlessly he commanded the space, how he turned a mundane afternoon into an event. She wiped her hands on a cloth, moving toward him with a deliberate, graceful stride. "You never give them a moment's peace, do you?" she murmured, her voice dropping into a register meant only for him. "Peace is overrated, Monica. Movement is life," he replied, sliding a bowl toward Ethan and Lily. "Now, off to the backyard. I've got a drill to run before the sugar hits the bloodstream." As the children scrambled toward the patio, their voices rising in excitement, Monica lingered for a fraction of a second, her hand brushing against his arm. The tension between them was electric, a silent communication that bypassed the need for words. Out in the yard, the grass was lush and vibrant. Ethan and Lily stood in the center, blinking as Uncle Blue began setting up a series of markers. Monica stood by the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching the way he stood, his posture grounded, his eyes alert. She felt a familiar, sharp pang of desire. It wasn't just the way he moved, it was the way he saw the world, as if every moment were a puzzle waiting to be solved. She thought about the life she had, the routines, the spreadsheets, the quiet, predictable evenings. Then she looked at Blue, who represented a rupture in that predictability, a beautiful, kinetic chaos she wasn't sure she wanted to survive. "All right, Crash, Giggles, listen up," Uncle Blue called out, stepping into a boxing stance. "Footwork is everything. It's not about the hit, it's about the angle of the approach." He guided them through a series of quick, rhythmic shifts. "Keep your weight centered. Imagine there's a string pulling you from the ceiling. Pivot on the ball of the foot, not the heel." Ethan swung his hands, mimicking Blue's movements with intense concentration. Lily followed suit, her giggles replaced by a sudden, fierce focus. They were small, but under his instruction, they moved with a surprising, fluid precision. "So tell me," Uncle Blue asked, pivoting to face them, his shadow stretching across the lawn, "what did you learn in school today? And remember, nothing isn't an option. If you didn't learn, you didn't have a day." Lily paused, tilting her head. "We talked about why the sky turns orange at sunset. The teacher called it Rayleigh scattering." Uncle Blue leaned in, his expression turning grave and attentive. "Rayleigh scattering. That's a heavy concept for a Tuesday. Walk me through it." The light from the sun has to travel through more atmosphere when it's low, Lily explained, her hands tracing an arc in the air. The blue light gets scattered away by the air molecules, so only the reds and oranges make it to our eyes. Uncle Blue blinked, genuinely impressed. I honestly didn't know the exact mechanism behind that. I knew the color shifted, but I thought it was just dust. Thank you for teaching me that, truly. He knelt down, meeting them at eye level. That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else. Monica watched from the shade of the rose bushes, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw the way Blue looked at the children, the way he respected their intellect, and it made her feel both exposed and seen. She stepped closer, moving into the small patch of shadow where the hedges obscured the view from the house. Blue noticed her movement instantly. He didn't turn his head, but his posture shifted, his focus narrowing. He signaled the kids to continue their footwork drill, his voice low as he coached them through a sidestep. They are learning so much, Blue, Monica said, her voice barely a whisper as she caught up to him. They're bright, he replied, turning to look at her. They're like kinetic energy trapped in a bottle. He reached out, his hands sliding along the small of her back. The touch was firm, possessive, and electric. Monica leaned into him, the scent of fresh-cut grass and the faint, crisp smell of his cologne grounding her. She looked up, her gaze searching his. Without a word, he tilted his head, closing the distance between them. The kiss was brief but searing, a brief acknowledgement of the heat that had been building since he walked through the door. You shouldn't be here, she breathed, pulling back just an inch, her eyes searching his face for a sign of regret she knew she wouldn't find. I go where I'm needed, he whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. Mom, Uncle Blue, look at this. Ethan shouted from across the yard. Monica jumped back, straightening her dress with a frantic, shaky hand. I need to. I have to go decipher that ancient recipe for the soup I promised for dinner, she called out, her voice a little higher than usual. You two keep practicing. Uncle Blue and I have some grown-up things to discuss inside. She turned and hurried back toward the house, her cheeks flushed, her mind racing. She knew he was a nomad, a man of cycles and rotations, but for the next 3 days, he was hers. She looked back one last time to see him laughing, swinging Lily up onto his shoulders while Ethan cheered. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was actually moving. Scene 5. Engineering the ultimate fort. The living room of Monica's home looked less like a residence and more like the interior of a burgeoning engineering firm. Sheets, starched white linens, and heavy, navy blue duvets draped over a skeleton of PVC pipes that stretched from the mahogany bookshelf to the kitchen island. Uncle Blue stood in the center, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, meticulously tightening a tension joint with the focus of a man defusing a bomb. Easy, crash, Uncle Blue said, keeping his eyes on the intersection of the pipes. If you torque the coupling too hard, the PVC will shatter. We want the structure to breathe with the weight of the fabric, not fight it. Ethan, who everyone else called Ethan, but whom Blue insisted on dubbing Crash, held a level against the vertical support beam, his brow furrowed. It looks crooked, Uncle Blue. The load isn't balanced. Lily, or Giggles as Blue preferred, was busy anchoring the rear corner with a stack of heavy encyclopedias. She looked up, her expression uncharacteristically grave. If the tensile strength of the sheets is uneven, the whole thing will sag in the middle, right? Exactly, Uncle Blue replied, smiling at the girl. It's all about load distribution. Tell me, what did you learn in school today, Giggles? Lily sighed, abandoning the books for a moment. We talked about how bridges don't just stand up because they're strong. They stand up because they're flexible enough to handle the tension of the wind and the traffic. If they were rigid, they'd snap. That was great. And always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else, Uncle Blue said, his voice dropping into that familiar, resonant rhythm. He reached out and ruffled her hair. Now, give me that cross brace. Crash, keep that level steady. We're building a sanctuary, not a tent. From the doorway, Monica watched them. She wore a silk wrap dress in a shade of emerald that seemed to pull the light from the room. She wasn't just observing, she was calculating. The laughter earlier that morning over a mountain of hot, syrupy pancakes had felt like a dream. And now, seeing Blue maneuver around her children with such effortless command, the ache in her chest sharpened. She felt a sudden, irrational spike of jealousy, not for the children, but for the way Blue could walk into a space and turn it into something vibrant, only to leave it cold 3 days later. Monica walked into the room, the scent of her floral perfume cutting through the faint smell of plastic and dust. She stood behind Blue, her hand tracing the line of his shoulder. "The kids are getting too smart for their own good," she said, her voice low. "You're ruining them for the real world." Blue turned, his eyes locking onto hers. The levity in the room vanished, replaced by a humid electric silence. He looked at the kids, then back to Monica. "They're building something that lasts, Monica. That's never a bad thing." "Is it?" Monica countered, her gaze flickering with a complex mixture of longing and frustration. "Or is it just another temporary structure? I know how this works, Blue. You come in, you fix the pipes, you teach them physics, and then you pack your bag." "You knew the terms," Blue whispered, stepping into her personal space. "You told me yourself that you were done with long-term complications. You wanted the excitement without the anchor. Don't go changing the rules because the fort is standing upright." Monica didn't blink. She reached up, her fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. The kiss was sudden, hungry, and entirely devoid of the playfulness they had displayed moments before. It was a confrontation of two people who were both terrified of their own needs. When they pulled apart, the air in the room felt thin. Monica stepped back, her breath uneven. She looked at Ethan and Lily, who were busy debating the structural integrity of the roof, completely oblivious to the heat radiating between their mother and the man in the center of the room. "Ethan, Lily," Monica said, her voice regaining its composure with a snap. "Take those books and go finish your reading in your rooms. Now. Uncle Blue and I have some very grown-up things to discuss. We're trying to decipher a century-old family recipe that has been crumbling in the attic, and I need a steady hand to hold the parchment while I read the ink." Ethan looked at his sister, then at the fort, then at his mom. "But we haven't tested the structural load with the pillows yet. The fort will survive the night crash," Uncle Blue said, his voice smooth and reassuring, though he kept his gaze fixed on Monica. "Go on. Learn something new about your ancestors." As the kids scurried off, the room felt suddenly intensely quiet. The only sound was the soft creak of the PVC frame as it settled. Monica turned to the kitchen island, where a yellowed, fragile piece of paper lay waiting, but her heart wasn't on the recipe. She looked at the man who moved through her life like a ghost present enough to leave a mark, but never long enough to stay. "A recipe?" Blue asked, a smirk playing on his lips as he moved to join her. "You're going to tell me you really need help reading a list of ingredients?" "I need help reading a lot of things, Blue," Monica replied, her eyes searching his. "And for once, I'm not sure if you're the teacher or the lesson." Blue stood still, the weight of the nomadic life he led pressing down on him for a brief, flickering second, a moment of profound vulnerability where he wondered if the ledger he kept was a blueprint for a future he was actually allowed to inhabit, or just a map of all the places he'd never be able to call home. He cleared his throat, pushing the thought back into the dark corners of his mind. "Let's see what's in this recipe," he said, stepping into the light of the kitchen. "Maybe we'll find something worth keeping." Scene 6. Scientific Lessons and Secrets. The air in Monica's kitchen hung heavy and humid, thick with the scent of strawberry jam and the electric static of a mid-July thunderstorm brewing outside. Uncle Blue stood by the kitchen island, his pulse drumming a steady, restless rhythm against his ribs. He watched the light of a charcoal sky press against the window, the gray clouds mirroring the subtle, shifting tension that always accompanied his final hours in a house. He wasn't a man meant for foundations of stone, but rather for the kinetic energy of movement. Ethan, whom Blue affectionately called Crash, and Lily, known to him as Giggles, sat perched on the high stools, their eyes wide as saucers. They had just demolished a massive pile of sliders. "All right, you two," Blue said, his voice dropping into that smooth, conspiratorial register that made the kids sit up straighter. Before the rain starts properly and we retreat to the living room for board games, tell me, what did you learn in school today? Crash leaned forward, tapping his chin. Nothing, really, just some stuff about light. Blue raised an eyebrow, leaning back against the marble counter. Nothing? Crash, you can't have a good day in school if you don't learn anything. If you're just sitting there, you're drifting. Tell me the truth. What was the light lesson? Giggles chimed in, bouncing on her seat. It was bioluminescence. Things that glow in the dark naturally, like jellyfish and fireflies. Blue's face lit up with genuine, boyish wonder. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out several plastic water bottles and a handful of glow sticks he had picked up earlier. He snapped the sticks, causing them to pulse with vibrant neon light, and dropped them into the water. As he shook the bottles, the liquid swirled into a glowing, ethereal vortex. He then began teaching them the physics of the light, showing them how the chemical reaction mimicked the internal energy found in deep-sea creatures, his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as he demonstrated the agitation process to keep the light consistent. That was great, Blue said, his voice softening as he wiped neon-tinted water from his thumb. And always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else. In the living room, Monica stood by the mahogany bookshelf, arranging a collection of porcelain birds she had been meaning to dust for weeks. She wasn't watching the lesson, but she was listening. She caught the cadence of his voice, that specific, melodic tone that made the walls feel less like a cage and more like a sanctuary. She felt a surge of possessiveness, an itch to tether him to the spot, even though she knew exactly who he was. She was a woman who prided herself on order, on the silence of a house well run, but when Blue was here, the silence felt like a vacuum waiting to be filled. Monica walked into the kitchen, her eyes tracking the way Blue moved, fluid, purposeful, never wasting a single motion. She leaned against the doorframe, her gaze sharp. "You're already packing your mental bags, aren't you, Blue?" Blue looked up, his smile fading into something more intimate, something that bypassed the polite mask he wore for the world. "I'm just observing the wind, Monica. It's time to move." "You could stay," she said, her voice dropping, teasing, but laced with an undercurrent of genuine challenge. "Maybe try actually putting down roots for once, instead of playing the wandering mentor. This house is large enough and the kids adore you." Blue stepped around the island, coming to a stop just inches from her. The air between them hummed with the same frequency as the storm outside. He reached out, his hand tracing the line of her arm, his thumb resting against her pulse point. "Monica, you know the drill. We agreed on the terms of this dance. Besides, look at the fine print of your own life. Your current housing contract doesn't allow for long-term male residence. You'd lose your lease before the first leaf of autumn fell, and we both know you'd hate to lose this kitchen." Monica laughed softly, the sound catching in her throat. She stepped closer, closing the final inch between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You're an impossible man," she whispered. "I'm a man who knows when a situation is perfect," he countered. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her temple before he pulled her in for a kiss. It was a lingering, slow-burn encounter, a collision of two people who understood that their time was a finite currency. She felt the strength in his hold, a brief anchor in the storm, and for a moment, the skepticism that usually defined her world dissolved into the sheer sensation of his presence. It was a quiet, profound crescendo. The world outside could have been ending, but inside, there was only the stillness of the moment. The sound of Crash and Giggles arguing over which bottle glowed brighter in the dark hallway broke the trance. Blue pulled away, his expression settling back into his characteristic, optimistic mask. He brushed a stray lock of hair from Monica's face. "I have to clear the register," he murmured, glancing toward the hallway. "And you have to get them to sleep. We both have our parts to play." Monica watched him, a flash of wistful longing crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with a bright, professional smile. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I suppose I have to go deal with a rather pressing issue. The kid's smart bulb chandelier in the dining room has started flashing in a rhythmic code I suspect is a cry for help from the wiring, and I need to dismantle the casing before it triggers a short circuit. A classic electrical dilemma, Blue said with a wink. Godspeed with the circuitry, Monica. As she moved toward the children, calling out, Ethan, Lily, upstairs, now Uncle Blue and I have some grown-up things to discuss. Blue turned toward his bag. He zipped it shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He knew the path forward, a map charted in lessons and temporary homes, and as he prepared to step back into the cool, rain-slicked night, he wondered if the next house would offer the same clarity, or if he was simply chasing a horizon that moved faster than he did. Scene 7. The last night at Monica's. And if you don't calculate the drag coefficient correctly, you're just a glorified paperweight waiting for gravity to win, Uncle Blue said, his voice cutting through the humid suburban air like a blade. He stood in the center of the manicured backyard, holding a pair of lightweight nylon sashes. Monica leaned against the sliding glass door, the light from the kitchen casting long, elegant shadows across her features. She watched them with a mix of amusement and a hunger she tried to disguise behind a stoic expression. Ethan, Lily, she called out, her voice crisp and steady. Listen to your uncle, or you'll spend your entire weekend grounded in those textbooks. Crash giggles. Listen up, Uncle Blue said, flashing a grin that made the backyard feel suddenly electric. We're doing a relay. If you want to understand aerodynamics, you don't read about it. You feel the wind fighting you. Whoever keeps their torso most parallel to the ground while running gets the extra scoop of strawberry gelato. Ethan, known as Crash, and Lily, known as Giggles, bolted toward the starting line near the hydrangea bushes. They were high-octane energy, vibrating with the prospect of the challenge. Uncle Blue crouched, demonstrating the perfect low-profile sprint. Physics isn't about being fast, it's about being smart. You minimize your surface area, you cheat the air, and you become a bullet. As the kids tore across the grass, their small sneakers kicking up divots of earth, Monica watched them with a quiet, maternal pride, but her focus kept drifting back to Blue. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted. She walked into the kitchen and opened the pantry, pulling out a box of artisanal pasta she'd been saving for an evening like this. She felt the heavy, unspoken rhythm of their time together. She knew tomorrow meant he would be gone, moving on to the next zip code, leaving behind a vacuum she was constantly trying to fill with routine. The kids returned, breathless and flushed with victory. They spent 10 minutes detailing a lesson they'd learned about how birds shift their wing feathers to navigate crosswinds. Uncle Blue listened with that rare, intense stillness, absorbing every word. When they finished, he knelt to their eye level. That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else. He helped them gather the gear, his movements efficient and fluid. He was a man who lived in 3-day increments, a nomadic tutor of life skills and secrets. All right, you two, Monica said, stepping onto the porch, her eyes locking onto Blue's. Upstairs, you need to be in bed. Uncle Blue and I have some grown-up things to discuss. Specifically, the living room ceiling fan is making a rhythmic ticking sound that is driving me to distraction. We need to recalibrate the blade pitch and check the ballast settings, or the imbalance will eventually rattle the whole fixture loose. The kids grumbled, gave their uncle a high five, and vanished into the house. The silence that followed was thick, pressing in from the dark corners of the garden. The air smelled of wet grass and the faint, citrusy perfume Monica wore. As they stepped into the living room, the ceiling fan hummed with a metallic, uneven clicking, a heartbeat out of sync. Blue didn't move toward the fan. He stopped, inches from her, the space between them charged with a sudden, sharp gravity. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was firm, grounding. You always have the most interesting mechanical emergencies, Blue murmured, his voice dropping into a register meant only for her. Monica looked up at him, her skepticism momentarily dissolving. The house is restless tonight, she whispered, and you're never here long enough to fix anything properly. Maybe you don't want it fixed? Blue said, his gaze tracing the line of her throat. She reached out, grabbing the lapel of his jacket and pulling him closer until there was no room for anything else. The ceiling fan continued its erratic, clicking protest, but neither of them heard it. The world outside the room, the ledger, the 12 families, the lessons faded into a peripheral blur. She felt the steady, calm strength of him, a sharp contrast to the chaotic, yearning rhythm of her own life. She leaned in, and he met her halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that tasted like shared secrets and temporary promises. It wasn't the tentative dance of a new romance. It was the desperate, focused intensity of two people acknowledging the constraints of their reality. He held her waist, his thumbs pressing into the small of her back, anchoring her as if the floor were tilting. They broke apart, breathless, the air in the room feeling thinner, warmer. Monica kept her forehead pressed against his, her eyes closed. "You move too fast, Blue," she murmured. "I'm not looking for a permanent arrangement, and you certainly don't offer one. So why do I feel like I'm losing something every time you pack that bag?" Blue looked at her, his expression a mixture of profound tenderness and the detached, restless logic that defined his existence. "Because you're looking for a finish line, and I'm just trying to keep the momentum going." He replied softly, "This is what you wanted, isn't it? No strings, just the thrill of the interval." She pulled away, her eyes searching his for a vulnerability he rarely exposed. "Maybe I just wanted you to stay until the ticking stopped." Blue looked up at the ceiling fan, then back at her, a faint, sad smile playing on his lips. "The clicking is a symptom, Monica. If we fix it, the silence that follows might be louder than the noise." He stepped back, turning his attention to the light fixture, picking up a screwdriver from the table. The moment of intimacy was tucked away like a precious, fragile document. He began to work, his movements precise and methodical, leaving her standing there in the cooling air of the room, wondering if the tension they just shared would be enough to hold her over until the next time he chose to return. Scene 8. Buster and Squirt join forces. The afternoon sun hung low over the driveway, casting long, amber-colored shadows that stretched like taffy across the cracked asphalt of Chloe's home. The air smelled of honeysuckle and the anticipation of something electric. Uncle Blue pulled into the driveway, his vintage hatchback humming a low, steady tune that signaled his arrival before the engine even cut out. He climbed out, adjusting his sleeves with a rhythmic snap, and hoisted 3 massive boxes of tacos from the passenger seat. The savory scent of seasoned beef and cilantro cut through the humid air. Inside, Chloe stood at the kitchen island, smoothing down the fabric of her silk blouse. She caught her reflection in the window eye's bright pulse hammering against her throat. She had been vibrating with a restless energy all morning, the kind that usually only settled when he was near. She turned toward the front door just as the kids came barreling into the entryway. Noah, who Blue called Buster, and Ava, known as Squirt, were already halfway to the door, their faces illuminated with pure, unadulterated joy. "Uncle Blue, you're back!" Noah shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. Ava hopped from one foot to the other, her braids swinging. "Taco Day! He brought the real deal this time," Uncle Blue grinned, an expression that seemed to swallow the entire driveway in warmth. He handed the boxes over with a flourish. "Tacos for the team," he declared, his voice smooth and resonant. "But first, we've got some serious work to do. We've got a tennis serve to master, and gravity isn't going to conquer itself." Chloe watched from the threshold, her hands gripping the doorframe. She looked at Noah, her energetic, spirited boy, and Ava, her thoughtfully observant daughter, and felt a pang of genuine gratitude for the way Blue could turn a simple Tuesday into a landmark event. She stepped onto the porch. "Noah, Ava, wash up and get these to the patio table," she said, her voice composed despite the racing of her heart. While the children scrambled to the kitchen, Blue stayed on the asphalt, pulling a pair of worn tennis rackets from his trunk. He beckoned them back out a moment later. "All right, listen up. A serve isn't just about hitting a ball. It's a fulcrum. It's physics playing a game of catch with the wind." He handed a racket to Noah. "Buster, keep your wrist loose. The power comes from the transfer of your weight, not the strength of your arm. Follow-through is everything." Noah took a wide stance, his brow furrowed in concentration. He tossed the ball, swung, and missed by a foot. Blue didn't laugh. He stepped in, placing a steadying hand on Noah's back, adjusting his shoulder angle.